Tomb guard sues rich senator for $100 M. What he reveals could destroy his political career. It was a day that would forever change the life of both the tomb guard and the senator, setting in motion events that no one could have predicted. The quiet life of a man who had once stood vigil at one of the nation's most sacred monuments was about to collide with the political machine of one of the most powerful senators in the country. The tomb guard, known for his calm demeanor and strict discipline, had spent years protecting the history and the people's trust. He had been part of a dedicated team, guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. His job was more than just standing still in a ceremonial uniform. It was about protecting a sacred memory, guarding the lives and sacrifices of countless heroes who had come before him. For many, the tomb guard symbolized integrity and duty. He was an example of selflessness, a man who would never step away from his post. But despite the respect and reverence he received, the tomb guard wasn't just a monument keeper. He had a life before his service at the tomb. He had lived in various places, had a family, and had seen the struggles that many ordinary Americans faced. His military service wasn't just about protecting a piece of stone. It was about protecting people, their freedom, their right to live without fear. This deep sense of duty had driven him throughout his years of service. However, after retiring from the military, the tomb guard had decided to keep a low profile. He avoided the limelight, preferring instead to live quietly in the background. Little did he know that his life would be thrust back into the public eye in the most unexpected and dramatic way. The senator, on the other hand, was a man of influence. Wealthy, powerful, and connected, he had risen through the ranks of politics over the years. His face was known to every American, and his name was synonymous with success and authority. He had made his fortune through business dealings and his involvement in politics, and he held the kind of power that allowed him to shape policy and influence the future of the nation. He was well liked by his supporters, respected by his peers, and feared by his enemies. But like many figures in power, his success had come at a cost. He had made enemies along the way, some of whom were much closer than anyone realized. The senator's political career was built on promises of change and prosperity. He often spoke about the importance of loyalty to the country, the honor of serving the people, and the need for integrity in leadership. He had gained significant popularity by positioning himself as a protector of national security, a voice for the common man who would always fight for the greater good. It was during one of his many public speeches that the senator's path crossed with the tomb guard. The senator had visited the National Monument for a special ceremony, and as was customary, the tomb guard had been stationed at his post during the event. It was a brief encounter, one that many would consider just another day in the routine of monumental service. However, it was during this interaction that the first seeds of conflict were planted. The tomb guard had performed his duties without hesitation, as always, but something about that ceremony didn't sit right with him. He couldn't explain it at first, but he had felt a strange sense of unease that day. The senator had approached him with a handshake and a few words of gratitude for his service. But in the midst of the polite conversation, the tomb guard sensed something more, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure. The senator had hinted at something that made the tomb guard uneasy. It was a passing remark about national security, something about how crucial the guard's role was, not just at the monument, but in a much broader context. The tomb guard had heard these types of conversations before, usually from officials higher up in the ranks, but there was a peculiar undertone in the senator's voice that made him pause. It wasn't until later that he realized the full implications of that conversation. Months passed and the tomb guard moved on with his life. But then one day a letter arrived, something he never expected. It was an official legal notice, a summons to appear in court. The sender, none other than the senator himself. The tomb guard's heart sank as he read the letter, which stated that the senator was suing him for defamation. The senator claimed that the tomb guard had spread false rumors about him and had tarnished his reputation. It was an absurd accusation, and the tomb guard was left stunned. How could he, a humble man who had spent his life in service to his country, be accused of such a thing? The lawsuit claimed that the tomb guard had slandered the senator's character, suggesting that he had been involved in illegal activities that threatened national security. The senator went on to argue that these accusations were fabricated by a man looking for revenge. The claim was not just an attempt to discredit the tomb guard, but to silence him. The senator was playing a dangerous game, and it was clear that the stakes were much higher than anyone realized. As the days passed and the reality of the lawsuit set in, the tomb guard found himself at a crossroads. He had never imagined that his life would take such a turn. He had always believed that the truth would prevail, but now he faced a powerful adversary who had the resources to bury any inconvenient truths. He had to make a choice: stand by and let his reputation be destroyed, or take a stand and fight back. What followed was a decision that would shake the foundation of the senator's career. The tomb guard, for the first time, decided to speak out. He wasn't going to let his name be dragged through the mud, not after everything he had sacrificed. But more than that, he knew there was a deeper truth at play, something much darker than anyone realized. In the following weeks, the tomb guard began to prepare for the legal battle. He reached out to a lawyer who had experience with high-profile cases. Together, they began to gather evidence, starting with that fateful meeting during the senator's visit to the monument. The tomb guard went through every detail of that day in his mind, hoping to uncover anything that might be useful in the case. But as he dug deeper, he began to realize that there was more to the senator's actions than he had initially thought. The senator had used his political influence to push the tomb guard into uncomfortable situations, even threatening the integrity of the monument's security. What had seemed like a casual conversation had turned into something much more significant, a quiet, yet powerful manipulation of trust and loyalty. The senator had been using the tomb guard to further his own agenda, and the guard had unwittingly become a pawn in a much larger game. The tomb guard realized that he wasn't just fighting for his own name. He was fighting for the truth, and he knew the revelation of this truth could shatter the senator's political career. The battle was just beginning, and both sides were about to be tested in ways they never anticipated. The tomb guard, once a silent sentinel, was now a man with a mission: to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. To truly understand the weight of the tomb guard's decision, it was important to know more about both him and the senator. The stories of their lives intertwined in ways no one could have imagined. On the surface, they were two very different men. But when you looked deeper, you could see the threads that connected them, threads of duty, ambition, and a sense of responsibility. The tomb guard, born into a family that valued discipline and respect for tradition, had always known his path would be one of service. Growing up, he had heard stories of the great men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country. His parents instilled in him a deep sense of loyalty and patriotism. They taught him that the greatest honor came not from recognition, but from quietly fulfilling your duty, even when no one was watching. It was these principles that guided him when he joined the military at a young age, determined to serve his country with honor. He wasn't just any soldier. The tomb guard was chosen for a very specific role, one that required exceptional character. Only the most disciplined, selfless, and capable individuals were selected for this elite responsibility. The tomb guard had to undergo a grueling selection process, including physical tests, mental evaluations, and the ability to stay composed under the most intense pressure. It wasn't just about standing still for hours on end. It was about embodying the very spirit of the nation. When he was finally assigned to the tomb of the unknown soldier, it felt like a dream come true. It was a role steeped in history and reverence, and the weight of the responsibility was not lost on him. He knew that his presence there was a symbol of the sacrifices made by countless men and women throughout history. His job was to stand guard, day after day, to protect the memory of those who had given their lives in the service of the country. For the tomb guard, this was the highest honor he could receive, and he gave it his all. It became a part of who he was. Years went by, and the tomb guard's dedication earned him respect and admiration from his peers and the public alike. Yet, despite the attention, he never sought the spotlight. He remained humble, focused solely on his duty. He would often hear people speak about the ceremony, how emotional it was for visitors to witness such a solemn act. But the tomb guard didn't think of himself as a hero. To him, it was simply a role he had been chosen to play, and he played it to the best of his abilities. He never once thought about fame, fortune, or recognition. His reward was the knowledge that he had served with integrity. But as time passed and his service came to an end, the tomb guard was left to transition back to civilian life. This wasn't an easy shift for him. The quiet, purposeful life he had known as a soldier felt far removed from the hustle of the outside world. He had no grand aspirations for himself, no burning desires for power or wealth. He just wanted a simple life, a life where he could be at peace, living in the shadows, far from the glare of public attention. His retirement was marked by a return to a quiet town, far from the eyes of the media and politics. He spent his days working modest jobs, finding comfort in the ordinary. Yet, despite his desire to be left alone, the past continued to linger. The tomb guard had seen things that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The quiet conversations with influential people, the subtle manipulations, the power struggles, all these things had etched themselves into his memory. He had seen how the powerful wielded their influence, how they used their status to get what they wanted. But he had never thought about it much, not until now. Then there was the senator. The senator had always been in the public eye. He was a man of great influence, respected by some and reviled by others. His journey to the top had been long, and his rise to power had been the result of years of political maneuvering. Born into a family of wealthy businessmen, the senator had been taught from a young age that success was about more than just hard work. It was about knowing the right people, making the right deals, and taking advantage of every opportunity. Growing up, the senator had been driven by an ambition that could not be tamed. He attended the finest schools, where he excelled academically and socially. He quickly made connections with powerful people, using those relationships to further his ambitions. By the time he reached adulthood, the senator had already established a reputation for being a charismatic, persuasive individual. His ability to make people trust him, to make them believe in his vision, was unmatched. But while the senator was a master of political theater, he was also a shrewd businessman. Behind the polished public persona was a man who knew how to leverage his influence to build his fortune. He had investments in everything from real estate to energy companies, and his wealth grew at an astonishing rate. His lifestyle was one of luxury, private jets, expensive cars, and multi-million-dollar properties. Yet despite his wealth, the senator often presented himself as a champion of the people. He would speak at rallies, hold town halls, and use his platform to address the concerns of ordinary citizens. It was a carefully crafted image, one that had earned him the loyalty of many. His political career had been a series of successes. He had won election after election, slowly climbing the ranks of power until he became one of the most influential figures in the country. His policies focused on national security, economic growth, and healthcare reform, issues that were close to his heart. But despite his success, there were always whispers behind the scenes. Critics accused the senator of being more interested in his own wealth and influence than the well-being of the people. There were rumors of shady deals, under-the-table transactions, and questionable connections, but none of this ever seemed to stick. The senator's charm, his ability to talk his way out of any situation, kept him in the good graces of the public. And then came the tomb guard. The senator's visit to the National Monument had been a routine affair. It was a high-profile event, with cameras and reporters capturing every moment. But it was also an opportunity for the senator to further cement his public image as a man of respect for tradition and honor. He had spoken with the tomb guard, shaking his hand and praising his service. To the senator, it was a symbolic gesture, a way to show the public that he respected the men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting the country's heritage. What no one knew was that during this brief interaction, a connection had been forged, one that would set the stage for everything that was to come. The tomb guard had been approached by the senator after the ceremony, and they exchanged words of gratitude. It was an innocent conversation at first, but the senator's remarks seemed to carry more weight than they appeared. His questions were not just about the guard's duties. They were about the history, the inner workings of national security, and the political influence that came with such positions of power. The tomb guard had answered politely, not thinking much of it at the time. But as the days went on, the tomb guard began to recall the senator's words with increasing clarity. He remembered the way the senator had looked at him, as if sizing him up. It wasn't just the admiration of someone who respected his service. There was something else there, something subtle. The tomb guard began to feel that the senator wasn't just interested in the ceremony. The senator had been fishing for information, testing the waters for something much bigger. The truth was, the tomb guard had unwittingly become entangled in the senator's world of politics, a world he never wanted to be part of. The senator had used their brief interaction to plant a seed in the tomb guard's mind, a seed that would grow into something much larger, a lawsuit that would shake the foundations of the senator's career. The courtroom had been buzzing with anticipation for days. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously, and the public waited eagerly to hear what the tomb guard would say. The atmosphere was tense as everyone knew this was not just a lawsuit. It was a battle that would affect more than just the lives of two individuals. It would have consequences far beyond that. The tomb guard stood there, a man of few words, his posture straight and unwavering as he faced the judge. He had never imagined himself in this position, standing before a court, having to publicly recount his experience with the senator. But now it seemed that there was no turning back. The stakes were high, and he knew this was a fight he had to win, not just for himself, but for the truth. And with every word he spoke, the walls of the senator's carefully constructed world began to crumble. It had all started with a simple remark, a casual comment made by the senator during their brief interaction. But as the tomb guard recounted the event in the courtroom, the impact of those words became clear. It wasn't just a passing conversation. It was a calculated attempt to manipulate and control. The senator had used his position of power to pressure the tomb guard, trying to coax him into giving away information that he should never have had access to. The tomb guard was a man of discipline, a man who had sworn to protect his country's most sacred sites, and he took his role seriously. He knew that the information he was privy to, especially regarding national security, was not meant to be shared with just anyone. But on that fateful day, the senator had crossed a line. He remembered how the senator had approached him, his smile warm and friendly, yet there was something unsettling about it. There was an underlying tension in the air, something the tomb guard couldn't quite put his finger on. The senator had asked questions about the guard's duties, the operations at the monument, and even national security. The tomb guard had answered with his usual professionalism, careful to remain vague and not reveal any sensitive information. But then the senator had asked a question that made the guard pause. What would happen if someone with the right connections wanted to bypass security here? It was a question that seemed innocent at first. After all, the senator had a history of making small talk with military personnel, even using such conversations to bolster his public image. But there was something different about this question. The tomb guard felt a subtle pressure, as though the senator was testing him, trying to gauge how far he could push. At the time, the tomb guard hadn't thought much of it. He had politely avoided answering, sticking to the standard responses he had been trained to give. But as the days passed, the conversation replayed in his mind, and he began to realize the full extent of what the senator had been attempting. It wasn't just a casual chat. It was an attempt to manipulate him into providing information that could compromise the security of the monument. The more the tomb guard thought about it, the more he realized that the senator had used his power and influence to put him in a difficult position. The tomb guard had always believed in the importance of loyalty and duty, but now he faced a moral dilemma. Should he remain silent and let the senator's actions go unchecked, or should he speak out and risk destroying his own life in the process? It wasn't until months later, when the senator filed the defamation lawsuit, that the tomb guard began to fully understand the consequences of his decision to stand up. The senator's accusations of slander were nothing more than an attempt to silence him, to bury the truth before it could come to light. And that truth, the tomb guard knew, could destroy the senator's political career and tarnish his carefully cultivated image. As the tomb guard sat in the courtroom, listening to the senator's legal team argue their case, he felt a growing sense of resolve. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. He knew the risks involved. He had seen firsthand how the powerful protected their own interests at all costs. But he also knew that if he didn't speak out, no one would. When it was his turn to testify, the tomb guard took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion as he recalled the events that had led to the lawsuit. He spoke about the senator's attempt to manipulate him, the pressure he had felt during their conversation, and the way the senator had tried to gain access to sensitive information. It was a story that no one had heard before, and it shocked everyone in the room. The judge listened intently, his expression hard to read, but the tomb guard could see the impact his words were having. The senator's defense attorney tried to discredit the tomb guard's testimony, questioning his credibility and accusing him of fabricating the details. But the tomb guard remained calm and composed, refusing to be intimidated. He knew the truth was on his side, and he wasn't about to let the senator's wealth and power silence him. As the days passed, the revelation of the tomb guard's testimony spread throughout the media, and public opinion began to shift. The senator, who had once been seen as a champion of the people, now found himself at the center of a scandal. The details of his manipulative tactics and his attempt to use national security for personal gain became the talk of the nation. People who had once supported him now questioned his integrity, and his political rivals began to capitalize on the situation, calling for investigations into his actions. But the senator wasn't ready to let go of his position. He continued to deny the allegations, insisting that the tomb guard was lying in an attempt to extort him. He hired high-powered lawyers who tried to discredit the guard and minimize the damage to his reputation. But the tomb guard's words had already left an indelible mark. His testimony had opened a window into the senator's world, and people were starting to see it for what it was, a world built on manipulation, power, and deceit. As the case continued, the tomb guard's life began to change in ways he never expected. People who had once admired him for his quiet service to the country now saw him as a whistleblower, a man who had taken a stand against the corruption of the powerful. Some people praised him for his bravery, while others criticized him for going public with the details of a private conversation. But for the tomb guard, it wasn't about the praise or the criticism. It was about doing what was right. The revelations about the senator were just the beginning. As the trial continued, more and more details came to light, and it became clear that the senator's actions had far-reaching consequences. The truth, once buried beneath layers of political spin and media manipulation, was finally coming to the surface. And with every new revelation, the senator's grip on his career grew weaker. But the tomb guard knew that his fight wasn't over. The senator may have been a powerful figure, but the tomb guard had something he didn't: integrity and a willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The battle was far from won, but the tomb guard was determined to see it through, to make sure the truth came out and the senator's corruption was exposed for the world to see. The days after the tomb guard's testimony were filled with uncertainty. The trial had opened a door into a world that most people never saw, the world of politics, power, and corruption. What had started as a simple lawsuit over defamation had grown into something much bigger. It was no longer just about the tomb guard and the senator. The truth that had been revealed now had the potential to change the course of the senator's political career and possibly even shake the foundations of his party. As the media continued to cover the trial, the senator's image began to deteriorate. He had once been seen as a leader who stood up for the people, someone who spoke of honor and duty in the face of adversity. But now, the public was seeing a different side of him, one of manipulation and secrecy. The senator's carefully crafted image of a noble politician began to crack, and the public turned their attention to the very things that had once been hidden beneath the surface. The senator's legal team worked tirelessly to defend him, trying to discredit the tomb guard's testimony. They painted him as an unreliable witness, someone with a grudge against the senator and a desire for attention. They questioned the tomb guard's motivations, suggesting that he was simply trying to extort money from the senator for personal gain. But as the days passed, it became clear that the senator's defense was crumbling. The more they tried to deflect, the more the truth seemed to come to light. The tomb guard, despite being thrust into the spotlight, remained composed. He had never asked for this attention, never sought to be a part of the public spectacle. But now, with the entire country watching, he had become a symbol of courage and integrity. His calm demeanor in the face of relentless pressure earned him respect from unexpected corners. Many people, especially veterans and those who had long admired the tomb guard's service, began to rally behind him. They saw him as someone who had done what was right, regardless of the consequences. But there were others who criticized him. Some believed that he had gone too far, that exposing the senator's actions was a betrayal of the trust he had once been given. These critics argued that the tomb guard should have kept his silence, that the consequences of his testimony would be far-reaching and damaging to the country. But the tomb guard wasn't interested in political games or public opinion. He had always lived by a code, and he wasn't about to abandon that now. He believed that exposing the truth was more important than protecting a corrupt politician, no matter how powerful he was. The fallout wasn't just political, it was personal. The tomb guard's family was caught in the crossfire. Friends and acquaintances who had once respected him for his service now treated him with suspicion. The pressure of being in the public eye was overwhelming, and there were times when the tomb guard wondered if he had made the right decision. Was the truth really worth the personal cost? But every time he questioned himself, he thought about the men and women whose sacrifices had made it possible for him to stand guard at the tomb. He thought about their families, their hopes, and their dreams. He had spent years protecting their memory, and now it was his turn to protect the truth. He could not back down. Behind closed doors, the senator was fighting a battle of his own. He had always been confident, always in control, but now he found himself at the mercy of a legal system that didn't seem to care about his wealth or influence. His political career, which had once seemed unshakable, was now hanging by a thread. The senator's advisors were scrambling, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. But it was becoming increasingly clear that the damage had already been done. Supporters who had once admired the senator for his strength and vision began to distance themselves. They couldn't ignore the revelations any longer. Some questioned whether the senator had crossed the line, whether his ambition and desire for power had led him to make unethical decisions. His political opponents seized on the opportunity, accusing him of being part of a larger conspiracy to undermine the very fabric of national security. The whispers of corruption, once whispered quietly behind closed doors, were now being shouted in public forums, and the senator had no way to silence them. As the public pressure mounted, the senator's public appearances grew fewer and farther between. He began to retreat into the shadows, avoiding the media and the public eye as much as possible. His allies, once fiercely loyal, now began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught up in the scandal. The senator's every move was scrutinized, every word carefully dissected. His popularity, which had once been his greatest strength, was now his greatest weakness. The tomb guard, on the other hand, found himself thrust into a new role. He was no longer just a man standing guard at a monument. He had become a symbol of integrity, a beacon of honesty in a world that often seemed to be built on lies. He was invited to speak at public events, to share his story with others. The press, once focused on tearing him down, now sought him out for interviews. But the tomb guard never sought attention. He had no interest in fame or fortune. His only goal was to ensure that the truth was heard, that the senator's actions were exposed for what they were. The trial continued, dragging on for weeks. Every day brought new revelations, and the senator's once untouchable position in politics seemed to slip further away. His lawyers continued to fight, but it became clear that they were losing the battle. The senator's own words, his own actions, were being used against him. His attempts to manipulate the tomb guard, to use him as a pawn in his own political game, had backfired. And now, the senator was facing the consequences. For the tomb guard, there was no sense of victory in all of this. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight. But as the trial continued, he realized that his actions had brought something far more important than personal gain. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had helped the country see the lengths to which some would go for power. He had shown that the truth, no matter how difficult or painful, was worth fighting for. The fallout from the trial would continue to ripple through the political world for years to come. The senator's career, once full of promise, would never be the same. But for the tomb guard, the fight wasn't over. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. The courtroom was quieter now. The tension that had once filled the air with anticipation had settled into something heavier, something that felt like the calm before the storm. The trial, which had started as a simple defamation lawsuit, had grown into something much larger. The case had gone beyond legal arguments and courtroom tactics. It had become a public spectacle, a battle between truth and power, between the man who had stood guard over a sacred monument and the powerful senator whose career had been built on a foundation of influence and control. As the final day of the trial approached, the air was thick with uncertainty. Everyone knew that the verdict was looming, and with it, the fate of the senator and the tomb guard would be decided. The judge, a man known for his calm demeanor and fair judgment, had listened to the testimonies, reviewed the evidence, and considered the arguments on both sides. Now, all that was left was for him to render his decision. The senator sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of stoicism. He had been through so much over the past few weeks. His reputation had been shredded in public, his allies had deserted him, and his political future seemed uncertain. But he had one last chance to salvage his career. If the judge ruled in his favor, he could spin the case as a victory, as proof that the tomb guard was simply a disgruntled man seeking revenge. But even he knew that things weren't that simple. The damage had been done, and no matter the outcome, the public had already made up their minds. The senator had become a symbol of corruption, of power gone unchecked, and that reputation would be difficult, if not impossible, to undo. The tomb guard, on the other hand, was in a different state of mind. He had never sought fame or recognition. He had never imagined himself standing in the spotlight, let alone fighting a legal battle against one of the most powerful men in the country. His only goal had been to do what was right, to expose the truth, and to ensure that the actions of the senator, the manipulations and abuses of power, were brought into the open. And now, as the trial drew to a close, he had done just that. No matter what the judge decided, the tomb guard had already won. He had stood up for the truth, and in doing so, he had preserved his integrity. He had taken a stand for honor, for duty, and for the country he had sworn to protect. The judge took his seat, his expression unreadable as he prepared to deliver the verdict. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers and the faint ticking of a clock in the background. The senator's lawyer sat with his hands clasped, his face betraying no emotion. The tomb guard's lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, sat upright, her gaze focused on the judge. The tomb guard himself remained still, his posture calm but his heart racing. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak. After careful consideration of the evidence presented and the testimony from both parties, it is my duty to render a decision in this case. The words hung in the air, each one adding weight to the moment. This court recognizes that the defendant, the tomb guard, has provided a credible and consistent account of the events leading up to this lawsuit. The allegations made by the plaintiff, Senator Asterisk, the senator's name, have been shown to be unsupported by evidence and based on the manipulation of trust and authority. The words struck like a hammer. The senator's face paled as the judge continued. While this court acknowledges that both parties were involved in a difficult and emotional situation, it is clear that the senator's actions were inappropriate. He used his position of power to pressure and manipulate the tomb guard into providing information that was not meant to be shared. This, in turn, led to a breach of trust and a violation of the tomb guard's integrity. The court finds in favor of the defendant, and the plaintiff is hereby ordered to pay damages to the tomb guard in the amount of asterisk, the amount decided by the court. The room was silent for a long moment before the senator's lawyer made a quick motion to speak, but the judge cut him off. "This decision is final. The matter is concluded." With that, the judge rose from his seat, signaling the end of the trial. For the tomb guard, the verdict was a quiet victory. He didn't need the money. He had never wanted the spotlight. But what he had received in that moment was something far more valuable. The truth had been acknowledged, and the senator's manipulations had been exposed for all to see. The senator, once a powerful figure with an unshakable reputation, had been brought down by his own actions. His name would forever be associated with deceit, with manipulation, and with a betrayal of the very principles he had claimed to uphold. The tomb guard stood up, his face calm, his heart steady. He had done what he believed was right, and now the truth was out. He had taken the risk, and it had paid off, not in wealth or fame, but in justice. He had spoken out against the powerful, and in doing so, he had ensured that no one, no matter how influential, could get away with using their position to harm others. The senator, meanwhile, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered career. The fallout from the trial would continue for years to come. His political allies, once loyal, now turned their backs on him. His supporters began to question everything he had stood for, and his political future seemed bleak. The media, once eager to praise him, now had a new story to tell. The story of a man who had risen to power through manipulation and deceit, only to be exposed in the end. But the senator wasn't ready to give up. He vowed to fight back, to reclaim his reputation and his place in politics. But even as he made these promises, he knew deep down that the damage was done. The truth had come out and there was no going back. The senator would forever be remembered not as a hero, but as a man who had used his power to manipulate and deceive. The tomb guard, for his part, retreated from the public eye once more. He had never wanted fame, and he certainly didn't want to be a symbol. But in the end, he had become one. He had done what was right, and that was enough. He returned to his quiet life, his dignity intact, knowing that he had stood up for the truth when it mattered most. As the months passed, the story of the tomb guard's bravery became a symbol of integrity and courage in the face of overwhelming power. People began to see him not as just a man who had guarded a monument, but as a man who had stood guard over the truth. His actions had inspired others to stand up for what was right, to fight against corruption, and to never back down in the face of injustice. The senator, on the other hand, would be remembered as a cautionary tale, a man whose ambition and desire for power led him to betray his own principles, only to be exposed by the very man he had tried to manipulate. In the end, it was not the court ruling that mattered most. It was the truth that had been brought to light and the courage it took to stand by it. And that was a victory that no one could take away.